The 529th edition of the Four Corners podcast starts right now.
This is the Four Corners podcast.
And that could make a difference. Lawson at the buzzer. Got it! Maybe not. Ty Lawson wins it at the buzzer.
Deep three. And Green rips down the rebound in traffic. 4-on-1.
What a great job. What a terrific job in transition. I mean, you couldn't plan that any better as a coach.
Gets the roll. Here we go. Page has it. Carolina down one. 84-83. Page into the front court with 4 seconds. Page to the rim. Got it! He got it! 9/10 of a second to go. Inbounds. Washington gets it to Warren. His full court shot. No good. Marcus Page baby. Does it for the Tar Heels. Carolina wins it.
Don't force it if you're Goss.
Comes in. Blocked by Meeks. Buried up ahead to Jackson. And he tucks it down for the 5-point lead. Matthews off the mark. And this year the confetti is going to fall for North Carolina. They're not going to be denied this time. Inside 30 overall. Love, top of the key. Oh! Big time delivery.
Here are your hosts, Josh Marlowe and Anthony Pagnotta.
Hello and welcome in to another live edition of the Four Corners podcast. We are powered by Carolina Electrical Services. Josh and Anthony here with you on a Sunday morning, Selection Sunday morning, if you will. And we're here to preview Selection Sunday because Carolina finds itself firmly, squarely on the NCAA Tournament bubble, with a lot of the projections not looking too good for Carolina right now. And we're here to talk about that because I do think with some of the issues that do exist on Carolina's resume, and there are issues, you look at the teams that they are going up against in terms of what the bracketologists project as teams that'll make the field over them where they're on the cut line with. Carolina's resume, I think, stacks up very favorably against some of those schools. And so that's what we're here to do this morning. We're here to talk about that. This will be the first of 2 live shows we'll bring you today. We'll be back live this evening after the bracket is officially unveiled at 6 p.m. on CBS to react to whether Carolina makes the field of 68 or if they miss the tournament for a second time in 3 years. Before we do that, though, we'll start every edition of the pod, as we always do, with the pod thought of the day. We go to Mia Hamm for today's pod thought, and that thought is, quote, "If you don't love what you do, you won't do with much conviction or passion." I think when you look at this Carolina team, the team that we talked about from November to Clemson lost in February, there wasn't a lot of conviction. There wasn't a lot of passion. It was a team that, for the most part, was going through the motions and was really relying, I think, on its laurels of who they are and what they possessed in terms of talent to get them where they wanted to get to. That's not good enough. And it wasn't good enough. But over the last 10 games or so, we've seen this team flip a switch. We've seen this team look like the team that we all thought we were going to see back in October when we were talking ACC regular season title, 1 seed in the tournament, and getting back to the Final Four. That's what we saw over the last 10 games. And I'm not saying that if that version of Carolina would have existed from November to today, they'd be that. But I do think that I'm confident in saying that Carolina would not be on the bubble if the team we saw over the last 10 games had been the team that we saw from start to finish. So I think what we gotta hope for is that this team finds a way in, because I do think that they showed enough over the last month or so that they're not the team that we saw the first 3 months. And I do think that should be taken more into account now more than ever because the game's different. It's a different sport. Your roster changes overnight once your season comes to an end. Like, we already know that if Carolina misses the tournament, we could expect probably 3 guys to enter the portal within the next 24 to 48 hours. You would also expect Carolina to be active, going ahead and finding names in the portal that they would be recruiting to bring into their roster. So, the NCAA Tournament Committee, they took away that last 10 metric, and I think that's something that they've got to bring back to the forefold, because you look at some of these teams that are on the bubble now. Carolina over the last 10 games has played as well as any of them, but that doesn't count as much as it used to. But I do think that Carolina has played with more conviction, more passion, and we got to hope and pray that the way the game ended on Friday night isn't our lasting memory of this version's team.
Yeah, I think they were helped by the fact that last night, Duke ends up winning the ACC title. I do think that that's something that needs to be taken into account against a very good Louisville team. Shows you that Duke, even without Cooper Flagg, probably wins the ACC this year, because they really are just that talented. And so I think that goes in Carolina's favor. But yeah, I mean, it's if Carolina ends up missing the tournament, they can really only put it on themselves, because they didn't play with, the passion and the energy that they needed to play with, the passion and conviction that they needed to play with, rather, the entire season. It was, we played with it. It looked like early in the season. You saw Carolina. I mean, granted, they struggled against Elon, but you could tell that team, when they went to Maui, they looked like a team. They looked like a team that was ready to do something this season and be one of the better teams in the ACC. And then whatever happened in Maui sort of derailed this team. And, that passion, that conviction disappeared. And you never really found it again until these last 10 games of the year. Carolina went 8-2 down the stretch. Their only 2 losses are to arguably the best team in the country right now, in the Duke Blue Devils. So we'll have to see how much that gets taken into account here for Carolina, and how much they put on that early season, those early season struggles. I think, the last 10 metric is something that needs to be brought into place once again, because, I mean, not even Carolina. Take a look at a team like Colorado State. That team in the Mountain West, they have been blowing everybody out. I mean, blowing their doors off. And that team is probably going to be a 12 seed because of their metrics, because they don't take into account the last 10, where that's a team that's won 9 straight and they've blown every opponent out. That's a team that deserves to be higher ranked, because you're closing the season strong. That needs to be something that you get credit for. So, I mean, hopefully they do end up crediting Carolina for that strong finish. And by crediting Carolina, let me make this clear. This team should be in Dayton. This team should not be solidly in the field. They don't deserve that. This is a team that should have to play in the play-in round of the tournament and fight for everything that they can possibly achieve. But I do think that there is a really good resume that's here for Carolina. I think the one thing that is missing is those quad 1 wins, and we'll have to see what the committee ends up valuing. Do they value the net, Ken Palm, that kind of stuff more than the quad system, or are they really trying to make the quad system matter more than any of the other statistics that they take into account? We'll have to see.
All right, so before we take a look at, I went and got 4 bracketology projections for today. Before we take a look at those, I want us to make our case as to why we think Carolina should hear its name called sometime this evening, whether that's early in the show, the middle of the show, or at the end of the show. I'll back up what you said. As much as I believe Carolina is a tournament team, this team should be in Dayton. This is a play-in team, and it's really just because, as much as I believe they passed the eye test, as much as I do believe they look the part of being a tournament team, they don't have a lot of wins against the tournament field that they can point to. And that should matter, because you're then playing teams in the tournament that you over the course of 4 months proven that you were not good enough to beat. But you look at what this team did in terms of winning 22 games. Like, I do think how many wins you have matters. The fact that they were 13-7, yes, in a quote unquote bad ACC, in a down ACC. We just got done watching that ACC tournament. That was as thoroughly a competitive a tournament as we have seen, I think, in quite some time. With some of the theatrics, with Louisville winning close games, with what you saw with Carolina coming back against Duke, even though Duke was out was without Cooper Flagg and Malik Brown. And we got to remember, Duke, with those two guys healthy, was down 12 to Georgia Tech. I do think that the week in Charlotte proved that the league is better than what most people say it is, what most people believe it is. Now, you're not going to think that. You're not going to know that because it's the Sunday of the selection show. And where's Jim Phillips? He's MIA. Dude's on a milk carton. Where's Greg Sankey? He's doing as many media sessions as possible to get to hammer home the message that he thinks his conference should get 14 teams into the NCAA tournament, which I think is absurd. But that's your job as a commissioner, is to sell your league, sell your product. No one does it better than Sankey, and we're stuck with Jim Phillips, who I think with some of his decisions in terms of not doing stuff this week at the ACC tournament continues to prove how bad of a commissioner he truly is. But I do think wins matter, and Carolina's got 22 of them. When you look at the fact they won 13 ACC regular season games, and then they won 2 games in their conference tournament, they won 15 games in a power conference. I do think that should matter. And you look at their losses, their only quote-unquote bad loss is to a Stanford team that was how close to maybe playing in the semifinal round of the ACC tournament, and a team that I think really proved and adapted itself very well to playing in the ACC level in its first year, despite having to be a team that had to travel east more than teams traveled west to go face them. And I'm not trying to defend and excuse that loss. Carolina should not have lost that game, but you look at some of the other teams that are on the bubble, and they have, I think, worse losses than Carolina's home loss to Stanford. So, I look at it just at face value. I think if you win 22 wins at the power conference level, combined with how difficult Carolina's non-conference schedule was and is, it's the most difficult non-con of any team on the bubble right now, that should count for something. Like, no, were you good enough to beat the great teams that you played? And you played a lot of great teams. You played Duke 3 times. You played Auburn. You played Florida. You played Michigan State. All 4 of those teams inside the top 10. All 4 of those teams will be top 2 seeds in the bracket that we'll get later tonight. No, you weren't good enough to beat them. My question is how many teams are? I truly don't know how many teams across the sport of college basketball would be good enough to beat those teams. And so, while we expect to win those games at Carolina, I don't think it should be held against them in the way that it is so far as we inch closer and closer to Selection Sunday. I don't know if my argument is convincing or not, but I just find it hard to believe that a team that won 22 games, 15 of them at the power conference level, combined with how many tough teams they played in the non-conference, I find it hard to believe that team should be left out. I think that team should be awarded a chance to compete in the NCAA tournament, albeit with the caveat being they start in Dayton and not at a true first-round site like many other teams will start later this week.
Yeah, I believe they should be in, and everything that you said makes sense. John Hinson, when he talked on the Field of 68 podcast earlier this season, he said that the magic number that Carolina had to get to was 22. And if they got there, then you would think that they would probably be in the NCAA tournament. 15, conference wins split between the regular season and the tournament, I think should be enough. There's no doubt about that. You look at some of the teams in the SEC that are going to get in more than likely. You're talking about teams that are 6 games below 500 in conference play, 5 games or 4 games, below 500 in conference play. That's simply inexcusable. I don't understand how you get rewarded for being that bad in your own conference, but they think that the strength of schedule in conference is really what matters. I think you're right to a certain extent. I do think that the ACC tournament showed you that there are better teams. I still don't think that it showed you that the conference is on the SEC's level or anything like that. The SEC, I think, is just a completely different monster. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that 14 teams from that league should be in. You'd love to see Jim Phillips get up here and fight for his conference. because that's what every other commissioner likes to do. I don't think you're going to see that because I just don't think that's how he's built. I don't understand why you need someone like that is a commissioner of a conference, especially when you're going through this time in college sports. But I think that's just the nature of the beast that you're dealing with right now. If you're an ACC fan, is that your commissioner is not going to be the one that's up there on television battling for you the way that Greg Sankey is, the way that Brett Yormark is for the Big 12. The Big 10 silent, but they don't really need someone that battles for them because they're in a pretty good position. So, I mean, I think for Carolina, what is the thing that I would add to the reasons why they should be in? It's really simple. It should be the eye test. You should be looking and determining whether or not teams are actual tournament teams by what you see based on what you watch. That's the question. Do they watch all these games? Or is this a scenario where they don't and they just go off the numbers? Because the numbers would still tell you that Carolina is a tournament team outside of one, which is the quad one victories. Everything else would tell you this is a tournament team. And the eye test, the team that's playing down the stretch of the season, it would tell you that this team should be in the NCAA tournament over some of the other teams that are on the bubble. But we just have to wait and see. To me, that should be the number one qualifier is you look at this team and you believe that they are an NCAA tournament team. I think there are some other teams that are on the bubble that you would look at, a team that sticks out to me. I watch Xavier. I don't think that it makes sense to put that team in the field. I think their metrics are not as good as Carolina's. They have a similar quad one record at 1-9 in quad one. And like I said, I watched that team. I did not look at that team and think this is an NCAA tournament team. So we'll see if that ends up being a factor. But with the fact that they've taken out the last 10 games, it seems to me like they are definitely leaning on the analytics to tell them whether or not teams should be making the NCAA tournament, which is a flawed way to pick the field.
All right, let's now get to what the bracketologists are projecting as of right now. We'll start with Joe Lenardi, who updated his projections at 2:00 in the morning after the WAC championship, went final there. He has Carolina among his first four out. Second team out of the tournament, he has them behind Boise State, who he has out of the field as of this morning. His last four in, they include Vanderbilt, San Diego State, Xavier, and Indiana. You move down to CBS Sports, Jerry Palm. He has Carolina first four out. Not really surprising. I don't know Jerry Palm in the last week and a half, 2 weeks. Really thought Carolina had moved the needle the way that Joe Lenardi had, where he had Carolina in the field as early as Friday morning. He has them third team out of the tournament field. He has them behind Xavier and Texas. His last four and include West Virginia, Indiana, San Diego State, and Boise State. You now go down to the field of 68, their network of their panel of bracketologists. They have Carolina first four out. Third team out of the tournament field behind both Boise State and Texas. Their last four in include San Diego State, Vanderbilt, Xavier, and Indiana. And then another site that we referenced when we did this, when we went over the bubble, I think back before the Duke game, was JBR Bracketology. Now, he has not updated his stuff since Friday, but he had Carolina Friday projected as a 12 seed. So it'll be interesting to see if and when he updates his stuff going into the selection show later tonight, where he has Carolina. But he had them on Friday before the loss to Duke as a team that he had in his tournament field. Another guy that has been very, I think, pro Carolina, Evan Miyakawa. He's a guy that, at every turn when you see him quoting tweets from the bracketology people or just talking about Carolina, talks about them as them being a tournament team. And I think what you need to make note of that is he's an analytic guy. He's got a formula he uses to divide up data, and that data will be presented and be given to the hands of the tournament committee. So while he may not have a bracket that he is putting out there and what he's projecting, his data that will be made available to the committee. And his data favors Carolina in terms of being a team that should be in the NCAA tournament field. Bart Torvik's another guy who does a great job with some analytics. You look back over the last month of games, so the stretch of what we're talking about of Carolina, this would be like what you would equivalent to where they'd come in KenPom. Carolina's 15th, according to his metrics, dating back over the last month. That's not a number that's accidental. Yes, you can look at it and say, well, who did Carolina beat? And who Carolina lost to. Those two losses, of course, coming to Duke. But they played at such a high level that they still were a top 15 team in the country, according to his database. So when you look at those four main bracketologists, and they all project Carolina out of the field as of right now, what stands out to you the most? What catches you the most by surprise about these guys, all four having Carolina out of the field as we sit here this morning?
Well, that doesn't really shock me because I think the experts really believe that this is not a tournament team. This is because of that quad one record. What shocks me is a team like Boise State being ahead of them. Boise State has a quad 4 loss on their resume. That should immediately eliminate you from any contention for the NCAA tournament. That doesn't make any sense to me how they are still being considered. They also got boat raced yesterday in their conference title game. So that one leaves me scratching my head for sure. And the other thing that was really weird from Joe Lunardi was how he, quote unquote, reevaluated Indiana and all of a sudden had them ahead of Carolina after they were behind Carolina the other day. Doesn't really make sense to me. Who do I think ultimately should probably get into the field? I think Indiana has a strong case. I think they probably should be in the field. But it doesn't make sense how you could put them behind Carolina and then all of a sudden, because Carolina loses a game to Duke, you're going to then place Indiana over them. Also, the same thing with Boise State, a team that jumped ahead of Carolina after they beat New Mexico in the Mountain West Conference semifinal game. They lose to Colorado State, a team that is clearly much worse than Duke. I mean, and again, Colorado State's playing really good basketball. They deserve to be in the tournament. They're locked in now, and they'll be an interesting team to keep an eye on. They are not Duke, and yet somehow Boise State did not drop behind Carolina after that loss last night. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. I don't see what the people believe is the difference with Boise. I guess they're looking maybe at that win over Clemson earlier in the season. But to me, when you have the types of losses that they do, you can't put that team in the tournament field. And the other team that I have the issue with is Xavier. I don't understand how people look at that team and think they are a tournament team if we're going off of quad one and the issues that they have. I watch that team. I don't think that they are a tournament team, and all the metrics would tell you that Carolina is better than them. They're also a team that's 8-2 in quad two. Carolina is undefeated. They lost to TCU, a team that's not going to make the tournament field, and Georgetown, another team that's not going to make the tournament field. So to me, I don't see how those two teams are ahead of Carolina. And I don't understand how Indiana was readjusted and all of a sudden put ahead of Carolina by Lunardi after he said that they were behind Carolina. So those are the things that leave me scratching my head about what the experts are doing heading into today.
I think this is where we got to draw back to Friday night. The worst thing I think Carolina did outside of losing to Duke was getting behind 24 to a Duke team without Cooper Flagg and Malik Brown. We can sit here and talk about the comeback, how they were there at the final second with a chance to tie the game, win the game, force overtime, whatever. But the simple fact of the matter was they faced a team on a neutral floor without its best player, and they were down 24, which is going to further – it gives the committee a reason to leave them out. I think if that game goes wire to wire, if that game was a typical Duke-Carolina game where it was a 3-point game throughout the majority of the game, I don't know how much Carolina really moves off the last four in line. I mean, maybe that's on the table. You can't rule it out. But I do think that, if you want to look at the eye test in that regard, the eye test would prove that for the first, 25, 26 minutes of the game, Carolina wasn't competitive until really that under 12 timeout of the second half when Seth Trimble and Elliot Cadeau really started willing this team back into the ball game. So, I think that's something that I think for Lenardi played a big factor into why Carolina went from into the field in terms of out of the field was just the fact that, he was looking at a team that was getting boat raced. But, as you mentioned, Duke went on to win the ACC tournament without Cooper Flagg last night, without Malik Brown last night. And yes, they were trailing at halftime. If you watch the game, it was not a question who the better team was in that second half. I was in the building. It was very evident that no Cooper Flagg, no Malik Brown. Duke was better than Louisville, and it's why they were able to win the game going away as comfortably as they were able to win last night. So, we'll see kind of if that's something that gets brought up, tonight when we get the bracket or not. But I do think in terms of Lenardi, that played a role in terms as to why he moved them from in the field to out. The other two people like Palm and Field of 68, those entities have been very steadfast about Carolina not being a tournament team. Palm was working for a network that believed Carolina had to win 4 games in 4 days to go dancing. So that really tells you kind of where their mindset was entering the ACC tournament. So when they lost to Duke, it was pretty much for them, all she wrote. Let's now take a look at resume comparisons for a bunch of these teams that Carolina is going to be compared to as we head towards the selection show this evening. So I just went and gathered what Carolina's net was and what their record in quad 1 and quad 2 was against the other teams on the bubble. So Carolina enters tonight 22-13, as you know. They are right now 36th in the net. They're 1-12 in quad 1, but 8-0 in quad 2, giving them a 9-12 mark in the first 2 quadrants. Texas is 39th in the net. They're 19-15 on the year. They are 7-10 in quad 1, 3-5 in quad 2. So they are 10-15 in the first 2 quadrants. Indiana, a team that you think has a very strong case to make the tournament field, 54th in the net, 4-13 in quad 1, 5-0 in quad 2. So they're 9-13 in the first 2 quadrants. You have Boise State, 23-10 overall. They're 44th in the net, 3-6 in quad 1, 5-2 in quad 2, which puts them at 8-8 in the first 2 quadrants. But as you mentioned, they own a loss in quad 3 and quad 4. And then you have Xavier. They're 45th in the net, 1-8 in quad 1, 8-2 in quad 2, making them 9-10 in the first 2 quadrants. And for what it's worth, if you want to use another analytical database that we use in the college basketball community, Carolina is higher ranked than all of those teams in KenPom as well. So I use KenPom a lot. It's something that I put that analytic in every preview and in every preview article I write for the website, and it's still the oldest analytical database that we have at our disposal. It dates back to 1996, 1997. And Carolina outpaces the field in terms of these other bubble teams as well. So I think that's where it really is going to come down to: do you trust the totality of what the net tells you, because the net would tell you that Carolina is better than all of these teams, or do you simply look at the first quad 1 metric and really hold Carolina's 1-12 mark against them? And I think the question that has to be asked, it has to be turned around on the committee when Carolina gets talked about. And it's important to remember that when Carolina's name gets brought up, Bubba Cunningham will not be in that room. He cannot make the argument. He cannot make the case for Carolina. But what the other committee members have to ask themselves is, what would these other teams' records be against Carolina's quad 1 teams? As I mentioned, 3 games against Duke, a neutral against Auburn, a neutral against Florida, a neutral against Michigan State, and on the road at Kansas. A team that, by the way, did not live into the preseason hype, but how many teams on the bubble would win those games that Carolina did not win, which might be a question if that gets brought up and gets properly dissected, might actually favor Carolina more so than other teams, because while they may not have won those games, one possession loss to Kansas, a one possession loss to Michigan State, a one possession loss to Duke, and a close loss to Florida on a neutral floor back in Charlotte. So when you look at the way Carolina's resume stacks up against all the other teams right now on the bubble, does it make you more of a believer in Carolina's chances to hear their name called come later tonight?
Oh, definitely. Because if you had better resumes, then Carolina's 1-12 record in quad one would probably mean that they were done. But I mean, yeah, you're talking about, losses, as you mentioned. I mean, I would put Alabama as one of the other losses. Granted, that one was at home, but that's another really tough game that Carolina lost. And you would like to think that maybe that ends up helping them. But I mean, yeah, it really comes down to me looking at these teams. And as you said, what would they do with the same schedule that Carolina had? I think most of these teams would not be anywhere close to the tournament bubble. Especially Boise State, I think, wouldn't even be close. I mean, that's a team that couldn't even beat Boston College. How are they beating the teams that Carolina's playing? Xavier, 2 quad 2 losses is tough for sure. And that's part of the reason why I think they should be left out as well. Indiana, I guess maybe they have a chance, but I mean, you look at that record in quad 1, 4-13. If Carolina had 17 chances to win, 4 games in quad 1, they probably find a way, especially with the way that they're playing now. And then Texas, I mean, yeah, that quad 2 record certainly sticks out to me as a reason why you could reasonably leave them out of the field. So I think you should be feeling better about where Carolina is than you were after Friday night. I do think that, you do have to put some stock into the fact that Duke was as successful as they were last night against Louisville. That matters. That's big for Carolina, because if that team had come out there and gotten beat, God forbid they had come out and Louisville basically controlled the game and won by double digits, Carolina, I think, would be basically not even considered today. Now I think they are actually going to be considered. Their metrics are way too good. And now it's just about, either leaving a team out that has one of the best net ratings that we've ever seen, or putting a team in that has one of the worst quad 1 records that we have ever seen. So either way, it looks like the committee is going to be making some sort of history. It's just which way do they lean, and do they think that Carolina actually has a better case than some of these teams like we do?
Yeah, so I pulled this comment up from Ray and Faye Keller, who said Carolina doesn't get any favoritism. They have to earn any spot that they can get. The bar is set high for them than other teams. I'd love to see Carolina in the tournament, but I don't think this team would make it past the second round. Hoping the Carolina staff has learned something this year and how to build a team. I do think that what may help Carolina is the fact that it's Carolina. As much as this committee will sit up there and tell you that they don't try to project matchups and they don't try to put teams in off of brand and rating, we all know that's a lie. If they didn't want to project matchups, the field would never be seeded. You project matchups by seeding a tournament field. So that's definitely a part of it. But whether this team makes it past the second round or not should not determine whether this team gets put into the field or not.
How many of these other teams are making it past the second round? Like, we think Xavier's making it past? I don't think.
I mean, we got to remember, there's only – how many teams make it past the second round? There's only 16 teams that advance to the second weekend of the tournament. Yep. So that cannot be what you use as a measuring stick, as a guide to what can we put this team into the field or not. What you can ask is this team worthy of competing on this stage? And I think that answer is yes. They've proven they can compete with anybody in the country. Look at all the close losses they have against some of the best teams in all of college basketball. Now they haven't beaten them, but I think like if Carolina was getting blown out, if every game was the Duke game in Cameron to all the other quad 1 opponents, we're not having a conversation here.
No.
And that was effectively Carolina's issue in year 1. when they were on the bubble before they got the win at Duke to solidify themselves as a tournament team. You go back to that team that had 7-8 losses going into the final game of the regular season. I think they were most of them were non-competitive. These were games that Carolina was getting boat raced in. Not the case for this year's team. So I do think that it's important to, I think, remember that Carolina, as disappointing as, having 13 losses as a preseason top 10 team is, a lot of them were highly competitive, and a lot of them were just, if the bounce goes the other way, they probably emerge victorious. And we're having a different conversation on Selection Sunday than the one that we're having right now. So as we get closer to the end of the episode here, with Carolina being projected to not make the tournament, as much as you and I believe that they are a tournament team, I think we got to look at the reality of the situation and say it's more likely than not they get left out. If they don't hear their name called tonight, which do you think will be the bigger reason why? Will they reference the 1-12 record in quad one? Will it be maybe they reference that home loss to Stanford? Or maybe just the fact that they were down 24 points the other night against their rival on a neutral floor without its best player?
Well, no. The reason why they wouldn't make it would be the 1-12 record in quad one, because we haven't seen a team with a quad one record that bad. Now, Stanford doesn't help. I said that when we were out at the Town Hall Grill. I said that's a game that you look back on and that really kills you because it was at home. You had a chance to win that game and you couldn't find a way to pull it out late. Yeah, Stanford, I think, is better than a lot of people want to believe. But still, that's a game that you got to have when you're playing it at home. But yeah, they will cite the quad one record. They will say a team had 13 opportunities to pick up more quad one wins and they go 1-12. And a lot of those are going to be the close losses. I mean, we talked about it when we were, getting ready to preview that Duke game. The thing that really stands in Carolina's way and the thing that's going to stick in your craw if Carolina doesn't win is the fact that Carolina had these losses to teams like Kansas, where they fight back into the game, come up short late. Michigan State, a game that went to overtime. Carolina had that one in their grasp, couldn't find a way to pull that one out. The game the other night against Duke now fits into that category. That's the second game in Charlotte this year when you put the Florida game in there. Those are the games that you're going to look back on and say, if Carolina wins one of those games, then we're not even having this conversation today. Carolina's probably in the field. Maybe we're still sitting here talking about them potentially being a team that is being talked about by the bracket experts and some of the people that are projecting the field still have them in Dayton, but we're not talking about Carolina being on the outside looking in. And so that's what I'm going to look back on, and I believe that's what the committee will tell you in one of the most awkward situations that could ever present itself. It will be Bubba Cunningham that will be having to explain that is the reason why my own athletic department is not having its basketball program go to the NCAA tournament. That's going to be weird to see. But yeah, I would lean with quad one, but I understand that the quad three loss is certainly going to factor in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt that the 1-12 would be the reason why. But we know this to be true. It appears that there's going to be some sort of precedent that's going to be set tonight. You're either putting in a team that was 1-12 and quad one into the NCAA tournament, or you're putting a team like Oklahoma who was 6-12 in the regular season in the SEC. And granted, I don't want to take away from what the SEC was this year. I don't deny and argue that it was the best conference statistically we've ever seen. I mean, I watched all those games on Tuesdays and Saturdays. I saw the level of basketball that was played. I know what exists in that conference, but 6-12 is still 6-12, and that's something that should be taken into account. You look at a team like Arkansas that is going to have one of the worst losses, from an at-large qualifier in the history of the net version of the tournament, with a road loss to South Carolina in a game where they were not competitive. Mm-hmm. Like, we know that if Carolina had that loss, they would not even be on the on the tournament bubble coming into tonight. So it's one way or another, there's going to be a precedent that's going to be set. And from here on out, we will have to, it'll complicate projecting the field moving forward, because every year there's a team like Carolina with its resume that's on the bubble. But because we've never seen a quad one team get in, we just write those teams squarely off. If Carolina gets in, then I think this opens up the doors for Xavier's moving forward, and among other teams moving forward. If you have a team like, the Oklahomas, the Texases, like if those teams were to find a way to hear their name called, guess what? That's going to open up Pandora's box for, let's say next year, the Big Ten is what the SEC was this year, and they can put 14 teams in the tournament. But you've got a USC team that goes 6-12 in conference. Are they going to be a team that's worthy of competing in the NCAA tournament? That stuff is going to be on the table. So it's going to be very interesting to see, which precedent they're willing to set, because regardless, there's going to be backlash. There's going to be criticism. I think it's what's interesting to remember. I love telling this story. Is that you go back to one of the last times Carolina was really in this position was back in 2000. They were literally the last team that was put into the tournament field. It came down to Carolina and it came down to Virginia. And Virginia's AD was on the committee that year. And because of the tiebreaker, his voice and his opinion was very much in play in terms of who they put into the field. And he was asked point blank who he thinks the better team was. He said he thinks North Carolina was better. Carolina would validate that by going on to make the Final Four. So I don't know. I'm not saying that if Carolina gets in, they're going on some run to the Final Four. I'm not saying that. But one of the last few times that Carolina was in this position, they got put in and they justified that by making the run that they made, which is completely different from where we were 2 years ago. And I think it's important that people understand that. When Carolina missed the tournament 2 years ago, I was disappointed, but I was not mad or I was not upset, because Carolina that year did not have the case that I think they have this year to make the field. Granted, they were in the same type of position in terms of where they were with only having that one quad one win. But there were a bunch of other factors that, like, Carolina never looked like an NCAA tournament team that year. That was a team that was broken, that was fractured from the first game of the season all the way to the end of the season. That team, when they lost in the ACC tournament, that team was done. That team was glad its season was over, because, quite frankly, they did not like one another. Don't get the same sense. You don't get the same vibe with where the Carolina is at right now. RJ Davis said on the podium on Friday night, we're an NCAA tournament team. We have fought and battled all year long, and if you put us in, we'll be able to justify that. And I think that I think it's important for us to convey that, because we're Carolina guys. We're very, I think, positive and supportive and uplifting of the program. 2 years ago, though, when Carolina missed it, I did not come on here and make excuses. I did not come on here and try to go after the committee. Whereas tonight, if Carolina makes the field, there will be a legitimate argument that they should have been in over a team like Xavier, Indiana, that gets in over them. You're muted.
The thing that's important is who actually makes the field. Because if a team like Xavier makes the field, then I don't really understand how Carolina doesn't make the field. If a team like Boise State makes the field, I'm going to be pretty angry that they made it in over Carolina. Where a few years ago, it was kind of just, you put yourself in this situation. It's not that shocking that you didn't make the NCAA tournament field. You're probably not a team that deserves to be in. I think this team deserves to make the tournament. And again, they deserve to make it and be in Dayton. But I think they should be potentially the last team in this field. It's just, if Texas makes it over them, I don't know how much I can argue that. I mean, I get it. Their record is 19-15. That's probably the biggest thing for them, is that they are just 4 games over 500. But mean, they play in the SEC. They picked up some big wins during their conference tournament run. And so I think there is a case for them. Some of the other teams, to me, like the Big 12 teams, I don't get them. Like, how is West Virginia, as concrete as they are, locked into the tournament field? Baylor's considered a 9 seed in this tournament. That team is 19-14 on the season in the Big 12. And the Big 12 was good this year. It was not great. So I don't really understand those teams being securely locked in. I'll be interested to see if the committee has them as securely locked in as the bracketologists do, because I think this has been a pretty flawed year for the bracketologists. I think you're going to be pretty stunned when you compare the bracketologist and what they think is going to happen to what actually happens from the committee. Because I think there's going to be some teams that you would think wouldn't be securely locked in the field that are. And I think there's ones that they think are securely locked in the field that won't even make the field. I think it's going to be that type of year. So it just depends on who gets put in over Carolina. If there are certain teams that get put in, it's going to be hard to argue. But I do think that tonight we're going to be sitting here saying to ourselves, regardless of what happens, that this team deserved to be in, even over some of the teams that do get put in, even if they make the field.
Well, if you go back to last year and you remember when we got the bracket as opposed to what was projected, the bracketologists were about as far off as we have seen in recent memory, with how the Big East got treated, only getting 3 teams into the dance. And a lot of people had them, with 5-6 teams going dancing. So, usually these guys are pretty accurate. They're pretty spot on. But there are circumstances, there are years where that's not the case. And we got to hope that's not the case this year in regards to Carolina's tournament hopes. Usually we end the show by making our predictions for a game. Right now there is no game to be played. The only way there'll be a game to be played is if Carolina makes the NCAA tournament, because I think if they miss it, we fully expect Hubert Davis to decline an invitation to the NIT to begin preparing his roster overhaul for the 2025-2026 season. So I'll give you the honors of going first and make your prediction. Do you think Carolina is into the 2025 NCAA tournament when we sit down at 6 o'clock to get the bracket?
No, I don't think they're going to make the field. I think they will be left out because of that Quad 1 record. I think they are going to put their foot down on that and basically show you that is the most important reference point when it comes to the NCAA tournament right now. It's going to be amazing that they're leaving a team that's as highly rated as they are in the net in KenPom out of the NCAA tournament. But I think they're going to use Carolina as an example. And, I think that's a poor way to do it. But I think that's ultimately what's going to end up happening. And for Carolina, you should be frustrated. There's no doubt about that. But part of it is that you put yourself in this situation. This is a program that should never be on the bubble as consistently as they have been the last few years. Hopefully this offseason, Carolina can get that ironed out with a GM there. But ultimately, I think this team probably ends up falling short of the NCAA tournament.
I'm going to remain to choose to be positive and optimistic, mainly because I'm not ready to face and admit that Friday night was the last time we got to watch R.J. Davis play basketball. I think Carolina gets in. I think Carolina gets in as the very last team, and there's going to come with that a lot of backlash. There's going to come with that a lot of controversy, but outside of the Quad 1 metric, their net totality tells you they're better than the teams on the bubble, and their KenPom totality tells you that they're better than the teams on the bubble. Both metrics will be at the disposal of the committee. And so, we can all sit here and say the quiet part out loud. This group does not watch every single basketball game that is played. Quite frankly, it'd be impossible to, which is why they have so much data at their disposal. That data suggests Carolina's a tournament team. And I think they will hear their name called. I think they'll be in Dayton. And we'll be back later this week talking about them playing in a first 4 matchup. No matter what happens, we'll have you covered on the website, HeelToughBlog.com, with instant reaction to whether Carolina makes the field or not. So be on the lookout for that article this evening. Once that news becomes known, we will have it up and posted for you guys as quickly as possible, as we'll either continue to take you through the basketball season or turn our attention to the offseason, which is the busiest time of the year for us, even more busier than the games itself because of all the transfer portal news that'll be coming Carolina's way with guys that are entering the portal and the guys that Carolina is targeting out of the portal. So be on the lookout for that article. You know, Anthony has you covered all things spring football-wise, so we just need to continue to encourage you to visit the website, HeelToughBlog.com, for the latest and the best coverage of Carolina basketball, Tar Heel football. As for the podcast, you know where to find us every major podcasting platform. Simply search the Four Corners Podcast and we'll pop up there. We encourage you guys, rate, review, and subscribe. That way you don't miss any editions of the show throughout the remainder of the season or going into the offseason, where we'll be talking about every guy that enters the portal, every guy that Carolina targets out of the portal, and so much more. And a reminder, this is our first of 2 live shows today. We'll be back live this evening on these same channels, the Heel Tough Blog Facebook page, the Heel Tough Blog YouTube channel, and my personal Twitter at @HTB_Josh. If Carolina makes the field, we'll be here talking about it. If they miss the field, we'll be here talking about it. So make sure you familiarize yourself with those destinations to be a part of tonight's live broadcast. With that, guys, it is going to wrap up this edition of the show. I do want to thank Anthony once again for hosting with me. We want to thank you guys for watching and listening. And as always, go Tar Heels.